Hello, this is Jose Luis here at Parametric Camp, and welcome to another video, which is probably an algorithmic modeling challenge. I don't know yet. Where what we're going to do is we're going to modify an existing web app that does this kind of design for crochet or for knitting patterns that are called color pooling or plant pooling. And this is because I was crocheting this object um, and I was using the pattern that you can see there on the left hand side. But in order to continue the pattern, there was a feature that was missing in this that I needed to implement in order to be able to continue, right? So what we're going to do is we're not going to create this app, but because the app is open source, what I'm going to teach you is how to take the app, how to create a fork, and then I'm going to teach you a little bit of how to look into the code and how to see exactly where could we do modifications in order to add the feature. And then in this video, I will walk you through the whole process all the way up to a pull request that I did with the modified code and with the feature that I had introduced and that I shared with the original author of the app that I just showed, so that he could decide whether if he wants to include it as part of the permanent repository and then push that to the actual app that is currently living online and that I was using actually on plantpooling.com. All right. So it's going to be a nice exercise of modifying an app. When I started this, I thought I was going to actually have to get into the pixel kind of pattern in the canvas, but it turns out that the code was already great and it didn't need any modification for the change of the size. So it boiled down to mostly changing the app itself, which is based on React. So I'm not going to get into React in this video, but you can expect to learn a little bit of how to fork a project, how to clone the project, how to look at the code, and a little bit of their overall architecture of React. This idea of component-based HTML reactive rendering, all right? And then how to make those modifications with a little bit of JavaScript, push that code and create that pull request, all right? It's going to be more like an exercise on trying other people's code and making small modifications. But it was fun, and I actually got the result that I wanted. So you can see a demo here of the square pattern and the number. So now I can say not square and I can create this like infinitely long pattern that it was not part of the original features. All right, beautiful. So I think with this, shall we get started? Let's get going. Beautiful. So let's get started. A little bit of context or background about this video. So for those of you who may not know, thanks to a student of mine here at the GSD, I recently got into crocheting. So I was having sleep problems and she wanted to build a machine for crocheting. So it was the perfect storm to end up like figuring out a hobby that I could use to just put myself to sleep in a way, right? So I've done a bunch of projects. For example, I've done this scarf that you're seeing. I made this by hand. It took me not that long, actually, not that much, right? But then it turns out that crochet is a very interesting craft, because one of the nice things about crochet is that it has a lot of flexibility and a very wide range of different stitches and different ways of combining stitches, as opposed to knitting that is a bit more structured, if you will, right? So it turns out that there's many different kinds of crochet stitch projects that you can do. And I very recently got into I started learning this technique that is called color pooling. Well, the idea is that color pooling is a technique that you can use when you have a skein of yarn that changes colors, especially if it changes colors very sharply without gradients. This is typically referred to as an ombre kind of yarn. I also learned that very recently. And the idea is that when you have this kind of yarn, the colors, the length of the colors in the skein of yarn is typically constant. And because it's typically constant, what you can do is that you can actually calibrate, how many stitches you do, and you can have those stitches match exactly the length of those colors. And if you match those length of the colors correctly, then what you can do is that as you're doing stitches matching the length of those colors, you can create these patterns that are exactly fitted to the stitches that you have calculated you can do for each one of the colors in your skein. And therefore, when you do that, these very, very interesting patterns come up. One of them is called the Argyle pattern. I'm not sure if I'm correct, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But depending on the length and depending on the width of the object, many different patterns arise. So I got very excited about this, so I gave it a try. And I've actually done this particular guy that you can see here, right? So, and the way I've done this is that, like many people do these days, what I've done is that I went to YouTube and then I type color crochet pulling, and there's a lot of tutorials that teach you how to do that, right? And then I ran into this particular tutorial that was very interesting because in this tutorial, the author of the video was suggesting that there was this app that you could do called planpooling.com that you could use to go there and to, based on the length of your stitches, to plan your stitching. So the app is on planpooling.com. There will be a link to this app on the description of this video and probably a card popping up somewhere in the corner. And the idea is that what you can do is you can say, well, my yarn starts with white, right? And then I have calculated that I can do 5 stitches, and then my yarn then has like a red segment, and I can do that. The red segment is, I can calculate that it's 6 stitches long, and then it also has a bluish segment, and that one is 7 stitches long. And it turns out that as you enter these parameters, there is this visualization here that is basically 1 fat pixel per stitch that is telling you, based on the width of your object, what kind of pattern will you see. So I can actually say, well, I'm gonna make this a bit longer, and you can see that this pattern shows up. You can make it wider, and then you can see that the size of the swatch, or how many stitches do you have in the width direction, has a very strong influence on the pattern that arises based on the repetition of this, on the repetition of the stitches, right? So I did that for my yarn, and for my yarn, it looks something like this. So can you see how what I have on the screen is basically matching the swatch that I started doing, right? I think it might be upside down, but yes. So basically, I tried doing this thing, right? And I cannot stress enough how helpful this was for me to plan my crochet object and to basically find out what was the exact width that I needed to get a pattern. Because imagine if I do one more stitch, the pattern actually changes dramatically, right? So I found this app extremely, extremely neat, and I was very thankful to the author. So I actually emailed the author at planpooling@gmail.com. His name is David Chatziki. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. He's actually from Boston, which is kind of nice. And then he pointed me to his GitHub repository where he has this app here called Planpooling, where the code is open source. So this was really nice, because what happened to me was that as I was doing this, right, this swatch, this pattern that I have here, right, is basically a pattern that is made out of 32 by 32 stitches or 32 by 32 pixels, right? And I basically got all the way. This is the 32 by 32 stitches that you see here. It's just that the dimensions here are reduced in this dimension, just because I'm using a stitch that doubles the pattern, that doubles the stitch per row. So that's why it's condensed in this direction. But I'm basically out of the pattern. The problem was that I wanted to keep going and do more pattern, but the app, as it is right now, there's no way I can control the length of this pattern or the height of this pattern independently from the width. I can make it longer, but then I would basically be also modifying the width of the swatch, which I do not want. I want to keep the width constant. So, I like writing code for creative stuff. So I asked David, like, hey, do you mind if I try to implement a new feature to your app so that we have stitches in a row, but I can also try to control independently how long this pattern is so that people who want a longer object can get the pattern themselves. And of course, he was super helpful. We had an email exchange very recently. So what I'm going to try to do in this video, or what I'm going to show you how to, I haven't done it yet, right, as of this recording. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to take this app, I'm going to run it on my computer, I'm going to try to implement that feature, and I'm going to try to contribute that feature back to David in case he likes it and he decides to include it as part of the running app that is publicly available at planpooling.com. All right. So basically, this is what we're going to do. We're going to download, we're going to clone this repo. We're going to implement a feature where we're going to be able to control independently the length of this height, the height of this object, independently from the width. And then we're going to pull request, we're going to issue a pull request into the original repository. All right. So this is going to involve a little bit of web development, a lot of JavaScript, and some computer graphic algorithm, if you will, or basically working with the context of this canvas that we have here. Shall we give it a try? Shall we get started? Well, first things first. What I would like to do first is I would like to make sure that I can run this on my computer locally so that I can do development on my computer, right? So the first thing is we're going to follow standard protocols when it comes to open source contributions. So the project, the repo is here under David's repository, and this is the name of the repo, right? So we typically don't work on other people's repository. So typically what we do is we bring a copy of the project to our own control repository. This is typically called forking. We make changes in our fork, and then once we believe the changes are good and ready to be published, what we do is we do this process called a pull request, where we basically request to take our code and merge it with the original, in this case with David's. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new fork. I'm going to make sure that the fork is under the parametric camp channel. It's called plan pooling. I'm going to copy the master branch only, and then that's perfectly fine. So now I am inside of parametric camp, and you can see that I now have this plan pooling repo in parametric camp. All right. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to clone it. So depending on how you're working with Git, you may clone in different ways. So I'm using SSH in my computer. So I'm going to copy the link here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to open a terminal here on my desktop, right? And I'm going to git clone the plan pooling app. And the app is now here running on. All right. So now I have the code here, and I have, what I want to do next is I want to run it. So first thing, I'm going to go into the repo, so plan pooling, right? And when it comes to Git, I'm still working on a Git playlist. So if you are not familiar with what I'm doing, hopefully there will be some Git playlist coming up. If I've done it, maybe there's a card somewhere here, I don't know. So we're in the repo here, and I'm going to see there's all these files here. So I'm going to move it all the way here, right? So the first thing that I would like to do is I'm going to take a look at the project, and I can see that because I have two package files, this is a Node.js project. What that means is that in order to get anything going, the first thing that I need to do is I need to install the dependencies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take npm install or npm I, right? And what that's going to do is it's going to take all the dependencies, all the libraries, all the packages, it's going to download them, and it's going to install them on this repository, right? So I'm doing that. There's a lot of stuff that is not working well, but this is a very typical thing for perhaps like projects that I was talking to David. He told me he hasn't worked in the project in a while, so it's maybe it has a lot of dependencies that are either old or deprecated, etc., right? The next thing that I would like to do is I would like to run this project. So the first thing is I'm going to open Visual Studio Code. I am going to open it here. I'm going to drop the entire folder to take a look at it. And because it's a Node project, typically inside of the package, there are ways to figure out what are the scripts that execute this project, right? What that means is that I have a start, a build, and a test script. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use npm run start to trigger the start script, all right? And as I do that, it looks like, yes, something is opening, but I get a really bad error, right? No, it compiles successfully, and it looks like, oh, no, it looks like it's not working. So let me take a look at what is going on here. All right, yes. So it was an issue with the dependencies in Node. So for some strange reason, it was not downloading right dependencies, and there was an error that was being triggered because of that. So I reverted to an older version. So if you want to see how I did that, make sure you check the live stream where I recorded this video. There might be a card popping up somewhere in the corner if you want to check that out. But I was able to switch to Node.js version 16. I'm using NVM as a Node.js version manager. And then I was able to then npm run start. And with this, what I'm doing is I am starting a server that is serving the application locally at localhost 3000, right? And if I dock this to one side, you can see that I can now go and basically make any change. For example, console log here, hello pcam, right? And if I save this, the server will restart and it will update and refresh my current browser, which, by the way, I'm going to switch to Chrome because I like it better for development, right? So I'm going to switch to Chrome, and in Chrome, I'm going to go to, I'm going to go to localhost 3000, which is where my app is. And I'm going to now save again and see if it triggers an update, right? Hello pcam, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to switch. And yes, it triggers the update. It updates everything. So we should be good. I'm going to close the other one, right? And I think with this, we are now ready for development. So we have the app working here locally. We have the server that restarts as we are developing and making changes. So with this, I'm ready to now start making changes in the repo code and then have them broadcast live to the app here on the left-hand side. So let's get started with taking a look at the code and seeing how we can start implementing what we want on the left-hand side. The first thing that I would like to do when thrown into a project that I don't know about is to take some time to take a look at the structure of the project and see where can I start doing small changes and see how those changes affect the project. So this is a Node-based application that is running React. React is this library for the generation of web applications that uses this notion of components, or components being this kind of hybrid between JavaScript code that gets automatically decompile or transcompile into HTML objects that are reactive. And it's a very good framework for apps that have a lot of elements that need to be changed and updated when interacting with each other. So I know this because I do have some React experience, but I'm not a React person at all, right? But the first thing I would do is I would go into the project and check out the files. So for example, if we go to binary, you see that we have some kind of Git-based file. We probably don't want to use that. In configuration, we have all the files that are running the Webpack. Webpack is a tool that takes the React JavaScript code and turns it and builds it into an HTML plus regular vanilla application. So we're not going to touch here. Node modules are all the dependencies that are part of this project, which for React are typically a lot. And these are the ones that were giving me problems when I was installing, right? Public is going to be a bunch of index, it's going to be a bunch of photos that are basically assets of this project. And I believe that's because when you go to examples, you can basically see examples of people, right? So it's basically files that get copy-pasted directly into the app, right? So I may want to actually add a photo of my crochet object as well. Then scripts are the Webpack or the NPM scripts that take care of either running the app in a way that when we save, it gets the app gets refreshed in the local server, or that we can use to build the app or to create like the actual files that I need to post on a domain and I need to hang up in my server so that this can run for other people. So that is probably the step that the author of this project follows before he uploads the project into plantpooling.com, because you just cannot run React natively on a browser. You need to build it into regular HTML and JavaScript. And finally, in source is what I think our files are going to be. So React typically works with a main application.js. So you can see that this is basically a JavaScript file, but for each one of the sections, it's basically creating components. Components being a function, for example, top is a function that renders this kind of programmatic HTML that is not pure HTML, but it's basically a hybrid of HTML and these custom tags that are React components. For example, about also gets rendered with this function that returns this React based HTML, if you will. Examples is also the page. Color chooser is probably the component right here, so this part of the website. And then color choosers are either these buttons over there, new random color, I don't know where that is. And pooler, I believe, is going to be this whole entire section, right? Yes, so pooler takes the controllers, the color choosers, and it also has these HTML elements for the flat and the circular, right? And then the app component is basically a component that aggregates everything together. The router components, switch components, the about, the examples, the pooler, etc., etc. Everything here on the same place, right? So this is how React handles building the entire website. It's a component-based approach to building HTML programmatically. Now, we also have colorsquare.js. This is more of a pure JavaScript file, if you will. So in here, I can see that there's a bunch of functions. Like, for example, I can already see that there's a value of width, which is probably the width of this canvas. There's a bunch of chunks, back and forthify, draw, and I can see already that there's a draw function that takes a canvas, and it says the units in Y, the units tall, and you can see that the units tall are hard-coded to be the same as the width. This is exactly what we want to be able to customize. This is why we're doing this video, right? And make rectangles, canvas, color square is probably the React function that creates the component for the canvas, and etc., etc. So I think a combination of this and the app is where we probably want to set ourselves. And to make sure that this is kind of working, I'm going to go to the Draw app and I'm just going to add like some random, like, hello pcamp. And if I save this, you can see that the app reloads and I get here on the bottom left corner, I get a dump on the console that says hello pcamp, which means that my development environment and my app are properly connected and one is reloading the other. So I think I am ready for now figuring out modifications that I can do in the code to implement that feature that we want. All right, let me think for a second, how are we going to start doing this? So in general, before we actually start implementing very neat code, what I like to do is like to tinker around and to play with a few things and do like a quick and dirty, see if I can modify or I can get like a hard-coded or like a really rough version of the feature that I'm trying to represent, right? So we can see that we have the draw function here, which is basically probably the one that it takes care of generating this canvas here. And you can see that it already has unit Y is taken from some kind of state object that gets passed here, and unit stall is the same as white. So let me see if I can find this state object. So I'm going to go to draw and I can see that there's another draw that is passing. There is a call to draw function that is passing this reference to the React object and is passing this object called state that has all the properties, the number of colors, the color choices, number of stitches, and I can see that there's a dump here of that JSON file, which is probably the same JSON file that becomes part of the URL, so that you can save the URL with all the properties, send them to someone, and that with that someone you can share the same pattern without having to input it manually, which I think is a very, very smart thing to do. So I wonder if we can hack this a little bit around. So you can see that not units wide is in terms of stitches, it's not in pixels. So let's say that I manually go ahead and go to draw, and I'm going to cancel this, and I'm going to say const units tall is going to be equal to, for example, we are at 51, so 102, double, all right? So just twice. I'm going to save this, and you can see that the canvas did not become larger. So I wonder why is that? And I'm assuming that maybe here the color square React component, when it gets generated, it gets clamped to width and width. So width in this case is 500, which is in pixels, and width, this should be the amount in pixels, right? So if we have 500 and we just say double, how about I do 1000? If I extend to 1000, you can see that, yes, the pattern actually does extend. And now I have the correct amount of pixels, probably, right? Beautiful. So I think this is probably where we want to start. So I wonder if there's a way that we can do this a bit more programmatically. So let me do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say stitches tall, and that's going to be 102. And const is going to be, for example, a Boolean for, it's going to be called customize height. Stitches high, I'm going to call this stitches high. Customize height. And then I'm going to say true, all right? And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to change this, and I'm going to start playing with the state object. So I'm going to say state object, how many units tall this is going to be part of whatever the state object is. So I'm going to say units tall, and then I'm going to go to the state object, which is what we're here, and I'm going to say units tall is going to be equal to, and I will probably have to work with this kind of property objects, which I will need to address later, but for the time being, I'm going to do the following. I'm actually going to get out of it and say if I'm going to say units tall is going to be equal to props.num stitches, so the same amount of stitches, so that it's square. And if we have customized height, then we're going to modify that, and we're going to say state dot units tall has to be equal to what did I call this? Stitches tall. So that's going to be equal to stitches tall. And let's see if this works. So right now I'm going to save. I have a very tall object, right? And then stitches tall. Let's say that I say no customization. And this gets very short, but I still get this very high, right? So what I need to do is now I need to compute here const canvas height is going to be equal to whatever, what is it going to be? This is going to be equal to the size of each pixel, so that is probably going to be width divided by state dot units wide, right? So that's going to be the size in pixels of one of each one of these stitches here. And then I have to multiply that by how many stitches I have in the vertical direction. So then that's going to be state dot units tall. So I'm going to multiply that, and then canvas height is going to be this. So now this is programmatic. Oh, and it's not defined. Oh, because I defined it inside of this use effect anonymous function. So what I need to do is I basically need to define it outside canvas height equals 0, and then so that it's on scope. And now canvas height is part of, not part of. Ah, yeah. I remember this because this is part of how, yeah, I remember use effect is basically a way for React to pass properties to these kind of objects. Now I'm remembering. So I wonder if this is a good way to go, or if I can just make this global. And I can just say, you know, let canvas height, I'm just going to move this all the way here. And if I make it a global property, if that changes anything, and canvas height is this, and canvas height, and it's not working. All right, let me take a look at what's going on here. All right, I just refreshed a little bit of my React previous life, and I remembered that React has this pattern where what you can do when you create objects is that you can basically pass these properties so that whenever the component gets rendered, it uses those properties to decide things like the color, the size, etc., etc. So what we can see is that the color square is always being given these properties objects, and this is React that handles this. And it is from these properties objects that that we are creating the state object, and then it is also from those that we can render things in the actual component itself when we generate the div object, right? So what that means is that if I hard code canvas height, even if it's a global object, etc., it's not going to work well. Perhaps to be more React oriented, what we need to do is we need to make sure that this information, the height and the stitches, is not coming from some global variable that we have hard coded, but that it's coming from the component that it's rendering the color square. So if I go back to applications, and if I now Google here color square, if you can see that there is a component that, which component is it? The pooler. The pooler component is the one that is rendering the color square section. So that's one here, and is passing a bunch of properties, colors, number of stitches, stitch counts, type, etc., as a set of properties here. So what if I did the following? What if I added here number of stitches tall, and then I'm going to hard code here 102, and customize stitches tall, and I'm going to pass here the value of true. I'm going to hard code this right now. Okay, so I'm going to save this refresh, everything works. And now what happens is that this properties object does have this additional information that we encoded as part of the color square. We will see how to programmatically change this very soon, right? But right now we're going to hard code it there. We're going to remove all of this here, okay? And then what I'm going to do is in the color square here, I'm going to change a couple things. So unit stall is now going to be something that is going to be if props dot, what did I write here? Customize stitch stall. If this is true, then I want you to use the value of number of stitches tall. So props dot number of stitches tall. Otherwise, if it's not true, I want you to just use the same number of stitches in the y direction. And maybe what I want to do is I'm just going to change this, the name of this. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to say number of stitches wide, and prop number of stitches. I need a comma there. I'm going to save this. I don't need this anymore. I don't need any of this anymore because it's all coming from the React component, right? And then canvas height is not defined here. So I'm going to go back to width, see if everything works. It looks like it works, but I get this really bad object here. So I guess what I can do now is I can say, what can I save here? Yes, exactly. I hadn't saved the name here. Beautiful. So what I can probably do now is here, I can just work with the properties that the object gets passed. So the height is going to be, as we said before, is going to be properties. Oh yeah, because we probably need to do this as well. So we're going to multiply, we're going to do width divided by props dot and the number of unit of stitches in the y direction. So that's going to give us the width of one of the pixels. And then we're going to multiply this by a value that is going to be this same thing. So depending on whether we're customizing or not, is it going to be the number of stitches tall or is it going to be the number of stitches wide? And probably here I want number of stitches wide. Okay, so I'm going to save this, and you can see that right now, because I am customizing, it becomes 102, so I have a long canvas, and if I switch this to false, this should become a short canvas. All right, and it looks like the algorithm that David had implemented is already responsive to changes. So if I save this, and if I now close this and I switch the pattern, let me scroll this a little. If I make the pattern longer, you can see that it is adapting, and you can see that it gets shorter because the ratio between the stitches is just getting smaller, right? Which is also part of the plan, which is great. Okay, so it looks like the algorithm is already adapting for the amount of units in each direction, which is fantastic. All right. All right, so if that's the case, then the only thing that we need to do now is that we have been able to implement changing the canvas with a hard-coded value. So what I think we need to do now is to figure out how can we add here some kind of option to customize, to basically be able to programmatically insert whether if we want to customize the height or not and the amount of customization. So I'm going to think a little bit about how to do that. But before we do any of that, let me just commit the changes that I've done. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to use the Visual Studio commit tool. I'm going to commit the changes that I have done to the app and to the color square. So you can see here that I changed this in the app, and for color squares, I changed all this stuff. So I'm going to add here testing a hard-coded version of canvas height customization. All right, and I'm going to submit that. And if we go to the repo, we should see the new, yes, testing hard-coded version. So very good. All right, so now we have saved our changes. So now let's think, how can we create some UI elements to control the number of stitches in the height direction and whether if they should be customized or not. So I've gone ahead and refreshed my React memory a little bit as well again. And without getting very much into the details, because I'm also not a React expert and I don't want to make this video about React itself, another good technique when you are faced with code that you want to modify, but you don't fully understand or you don't really want to get into the whole how things work, etc., is basically try to find patterns in the code that you have and try to replicate those patterns. So I think the first thing that I'm going to try is to implement, just like we have here an UI element that is stitches in a row, I'm going to try to implement another UI element that is going to be basically custom amount of rows and with a text box as well. So I'm going to go ahead and find stitches in row, and I can see that it's right here. All right, and I can see that it's part of a React component that gets generated using a properties object. And it's basically this kind of hard-coded, pseudo hard-coded HTML element here. So probably a good place to start is just copy paste this and change it to whatever pattern we want. So for example, I'm going to copy and paste this, and now I'm going to here I'm going to include I'm going to make two divs. I'm going to wrap this inside of a div, and then I'm going to move all of this inside here, and then I'm going to create another division, And then I'm going to move all of this in here, and I'm doing this so that everything stays inside of this choices selection kind of class. And I'm going to save this, and I'm going to see I get 2 of these. So now I'm going to change this name, and I'm going to make custom number of rows. And then I'm going to stitches, I'm going to call this stitches tall, and then the type is going to be types, and then the value that this is going to assign, this is a React thing, the value is going to be props.number of stitches. I'm going to change this to number of stitches tall. So I'm going to add a new property in the properties object to subsequent elements that is going to be the number of stitches. And then whenever this changes, I'm going to trigger an anonymous function that is going to set stitches tall and with this value and number of stitches tall for the ID of this object. All right. So this would be a good way. I'm going to save this. And now this is called custom number of rows, but it's empty and it's not doing anything. Well, it is, but it's calling this function that I have not implemented yet. So let's keep going. So where is this num stitches, set stitches? Where is all of this happening? All of this is happening here inside of the pooler React object. React has this pattern where you can create variables for the properties of the object, and you can create functions that are linked so that one uses the other to change their values. This is a really, really bad way of explaining this, but it's basically a way of creating functions and variables that are linked in their values together, right? So what I can do is I can now, and they're monitored by React. So whenever one changes, the HTML gets updated automatically. So what I can create is an array with 2 of these properties. One is going to be number of stitches tall, as I have defined here, the one that I'm passing on to the element. And the other one is going to be a function that is going to be set number of stitches, set stitches, set number of stitches, set number of stitches tall. Yes. Set number of stitches tall. All right. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this. So I'm going to use the state from the URL. I'm going to call it units tall so that I fetched an initial value from this state object that I have here. Or by default, I'm going to use the value of 1 of 51. All right. I also need to update this state value. This state is a JSON file that gets serialized into the URL so that I can have a URL with a lot of data that I can pass around. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to now add here units tall, just as I did here, units tall, and then number of stitches tall. All right. So that I get it from this value here. All right. Beautiful. And then what else? So you can see that in the length controller and the color chooser, these are React objects that get past all this information. So I'm going to clean this up a little, and I'm going to, oops, sorry for that. I'm going to indent this here. I like to see it better like this, right? So we have here set stitches, set number of stitches, add stitches, add stitches. So these are values and functions that get passed to the children objects in the component when they get serialized into HTML. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add number of stitches. Do I have that? No, I already have the number of stitches. I have it there. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say number of stitches tall is going to be equal to number of stitches tall, right? And I also want to create set stitches tall is going to be the function that I defined here, which is set number of stitches tall. All right. Beautiful. And then in the color square, you can see that number of stitches tall, instead of being the hard-coded number, can be from the properties, the number of stitches in the tall direction. Are we ready for this? So I can see that already as I saved, the number of 51, which is a default value, shows up here in the state at the URL. It shows up here, and whenever, if I change it, because there's a change, the number of stitches, the changed number of stitches tall gets triggered, and then I can now go ahead and say 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. You can see how I can customize the number of stitches, and it gets programmatically. Yoo-hoo! So it's working, right? Very nice. I'm liking this. I'm refreshing my React Live here. I haven't done this in a while. Okay, before we move on, let's save this. So added UI element for stitch tall count. So I have that and it's working. Beautiful. So now the next thing is, I don't want always to be the case. I want these, I want the value to be, this to be an optional thing. So I would like in between these two objects to create an UI element, which is a checkbox. And that checkbox be whether if we want a square pattern or if we want to customize the number of the rows. Okay, so let's see how could we do that. A little bit of Googling tells me that implementing a checkbox is actually fairly similar to what we have done before. It's just that the HTML element that we need is just a different one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy all this whole thing here. I'm going to create a new element, and this is going to be an element that I'm going to call, for example, ID of, is this a square pattern, right? So this is going to be a square pattern with a question mark, and I'm going to remove the colon, and then the input is going to be of the type checkbox, all right? And for checkboxes, instead of value, what we use is the property checked, whether if this has a tick mark or if it doesn't, right? And then what I'm going to do is that on the change, I'm going to the ID is going to be, I'm going to change this and I'm going to set an ID that is going to be, what is it going to be? It's going to be something like square pattern, for example. I'm not really using this, I think. And then for the onChange event, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create, well, let me go back here first. So let me create a state that is going to be, for example, square pattern, and then set, what am I going to call this? I'm going to call this set Boolean a square pattern. And then from here, I'm going to say this is going to use the state like I was using before. I'm going to either take this value from the URL here at the top. So state from URL dot, and I'm going to call this what? Square pattern. Or if this is not available, then I'm just going to have a true check, right? Okay, then I'm going to keep updating a few things here. So I want the state that shows up on the top to represent this new option. So I'm going to add here another option that is going to be square pattern, and that's going to be whatever value this state is going to have. And then for the controller, what I want to add is two more properties. I want to add to the controller. One is going to be this new value. So square pattern is equal to that, so that when the controller gets rendered, I can read that value from the checkbox. So that's going to be whether if this is props.square pattern. So whether it is checked or not will be read from the information that is passed to the controller. And then here what I'm going to do is I need to also give it a function so that I can change the value from the controller itself. So I'm going to create a function here called set square pattern, right? I'm going to create a property, and that's going to be equal to the, there's a typo here. That's going to be equal to this function that the state has generated that I can use to change the value of this property, okay? And therefore, what I can do now is I can go here and say, whenever this changes, what I want you to do is to set the Boolean square pattern to whatever the inverse, so whatever props.square pattern, right? But whatever it was, I want to change it to the opposite. All right. So that's like an on and off kind of situation. All right. So let's see if that works. So right now I do have square pattern true. This is turned to true, right? And if I turn it on and off, up, it looks like set Boolean square pattern is not a function. So I wonder if actually, no. Oh yeah, because I passed the name of this one, but I should have passed the name of the, how I'm calling the function here in the controller. So that should be, sorry for that, that should be this one here. So I rendered that and then I turn it on and off, and it looks like it's working and getting no errors, etc. But it's still not changing this. That is because I believe I have forgotten here where it says color square. Remember we had this property called customize stitch style, and right now this is hard coded to true. So what I need to do is I need to say this is now going to be the value of square pattern that I have generated here in the state, but the inverse, just because I didn't think this through, so I'm calling the two different things opposite, right? So right now this is beautiful. I turn this on. This is a square pattern. It's true. I have it true. The value is a square. If I change this to 100, nothing happens. And then if I turn this on, boom, I get a 100 long. If I turn this off, I get little. If I turn this on, right? And then, because my state should be updating, so square pattern false unitol, if I were to copy this whole thing and paste it in a new browser, I should get, it's not working. So you can see that this units square pattern to unitol, I see that something, no wait, is this square pattern? Square pattern is false and unit stall, but when I copied it, it became square pattern is true and unit stall. So I think there's something I need to improve here, because when I copy it, it just gets a state from URL, square pattern, true, properties is checked. Let me take a second to look at what might be going on here. Yeah, so as typically with many of these problems, it was a pretty simple or dumb bug, which is that because of the copy pasting, what I had done is I had created this rule where the value of square pattern was set to true or false based on whether if this is true v, then I get this value. Otherwise, if this is false z, then I change to the value of true. But because this is a Boolean, what I actually want to capture is whether if this is false or not. So basically, if this was false, I was ignoring that value and switching it to true. That's why copying this and adding it with a false here immediately switch it to true, which is not correct, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove this pattern here, all right? And make sure that in case the data is wrong for some reason, I force a casting to a Boolean object, all right? Beautiful. So if I now copy this object that should have a false square pattern property, if I copy this and I paste it, it does have a false, and it shows up with all the elements right here, all right? So I think this is great. I actually want to try it with the one that I was using. So can I do this? And then with 51, the pattern got messed up for some reason. Oh no, sorry, because it's I need to do local host.3000. There you go. And now, why did this get, because it's 32. Yes, it was 32, and now, this is awesome. Now I can do 100. Yes, this is exactly what I wanted. Woohoo! I am very happy right now. This is literally what I want my crochet object to look like sometime in the future when I finish it. All right, beautiful. Okay, so then let's commit these changes. So added optional square pattern checkbox. Checkbox. All right, beautiful. Okay, so I believe this is done unless there are some bugs or any other things. I will, if those are, I will address them offline because I think this video got a little too long at this point. So I think I'm ready to move on to the next step of the process, which is I have finished all the changes. I'm happy with the new feature that I have included. It's time to now offer these changes to the original author as a contribution to see if they want to include them in their published release. So how am I going to do that? I have already added all the commits. So if I go to my project, right? If I go to my repo and I reload, you can see that I have all my commits. So what is it? So all my commits, this is the last thing that the author included. And then I have added these 5 new options here, these 5 new commits. So I am ready to offer this to the author. The way this typically works is by opening a pull request. A pull request is basically knocking on the door of someone's repo and saying, hey, knock, knock, I'm willing to give you this so that you merge it with your original code. Would you like to do that? And then they get the option to accept that or not. So I'm going to go to pull requests and I'm going to open a new pull request and I'm going to say from the repository from parametric camp planned pooling, I want to send the pull request to David's planned pooling, all right? And it's going to be with all these 5 new commits, all right? So I'm going to create the pull request and I'm going to say added a feature to customize length of the pattern. And I'm going to add here includes a checkbox for a square pattern or not, plus a text box for a custom number of rows. Keeps the state, works with the state in the URL. All right, and I'm going to take a screenshot. I'm going to take a screenshot of this. And yes, and I'm going to take a screenshot here. Wait, sorry, I'm going to take another screenshot here. And I'm going to paste the screenshot here. I'm going to preview this. Yes, blah, blah, blah. And I'm going to create this pull request. And then after that, what I can do is maybe I can add to the comments, I can add here a link to the video that we are right now at. So I'm going to create recorded live on Pound. Beautiful. And I'm going to comment that. And I wonder if we want to add like my custom swatch. I'm not going to do that right now. Okay. But yes. So, and then that's basically it for the pull request. So now you can see that we are on David's planned pooling. And on his pull requests, there's like a bunch of Dependabot pull requests. And then there's the one that I just opened, which he will be the one who is now deciding whether he wants it or not, and whether he wants to push this to his actual website so that we can see those changes here. All right. Beautiful. And I think that's it. I hope this was fun for you. I hope you learned something. I didn't get into the nitty-gritties of React, Node, etc., etc. It was more like an example of how to contribute to someone else's code and improve things based on a very, very practical example that I had a personal stake on, right? So anyway, thank you for watching this video. I hope you learned something. I hope you have fun. I hope David accepts the pull request. And if you liked it, maybe consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel, saying hi, joining Discord, etc., etc., etc. All right? Beautiful. Thank you very much and see you on the next videos. Bye bye.